Great. Well, welcome everyone in. My name is Abigail Long, and I'm part of the education team at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute based in Portland, Maine. So I'm super excited to kick us all off and get us learning about vernal pools this spring. As a reminder, vernal pools are temporary bodies of water that form in some wooded areas in the spring and become home to a variety of life that are adapted to these temporary conditions, including a bunch of species of amphibians, caddisflies, fairy shrimp. So some really exciting things we'll talk about today. We're lucky to get to hear from two of our lead scientists on Project Vernal Pools, which is the community science project that hopefully all of us can contribute to this field season. So we have Aram Calhoun and Hamish Grieg here, who both study or have studied vernal pools and the organisms that rely on them. So before we hop into hearing from our scientists, I just wanted to show this map of people who've contributed data to Project Vernal Pools. As we can see, there's a number of folks involved from all over the state, which is really exciting. We hope to have more people collecting data during this field season. Collecting data from all over is super important to understanding these vernal pool ecosystems and how they may be changing. And I know Aram and Hamish will talk a little bit about their research and how this can inform some of their research. But I wanted to start by shouting out a few folks that are joining us in learning and or contributing some data this field season. So we have Herman Elementary School, Fiddlehead School of Arts and Sciences, Penobscot Community School, Ready, Set, Go Outside, Center for Teaching and Learning, some folks from the Maine Master Naturalist program, some homeschool students, students from Brunswick High School, and then some students from Hodgdon, Maine. So thanks for joining or watching the recording or contributing data this spring. It's really exciting to have a bunch of people from all over the state involved in this project. So why are we all here today and what are we going to be doing? So today we're going to hear from Aram and Hamish to learn more and hear some updates about vernal pools in the Northeast. And then we'll open it up for others to share or ask some questions to get us ready to then go out into the field to collect and contribute data to Project Vernal Pools. So throughout the season, we'll send some updates, um, validate your data to add to our larger data set. And then as the season goes on, feel free to send me any observations, any questions, any stories, things like that. If it's a question I can't answer, I will be sure to send it over to Aram and Hamish. So, like I said earlier, vernal pools are these temporary bodies of water that come about in the spring, and they have some temporary conditions that certain organisms are adapted to. So through Project Vernal Pools, we're super interested in these two central research questions, which are what is the distribution of caddisflies, fairy shrimp, and amphibian species in vernal pools in the Northeast? How will their distribution change as the climate warms? These questions can't be answered alone, and so we need your help to make observations and report what you're noticing in your local vernal pools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our scientists. I think Aram, you would like to go first.
Yes, and have you shared the screen with me?
You should be able to share your screen. Um,
Okay, great.
yeah.
Um, nope, that's not right. Okay, here we go. Got the right one now. You don't care about my Spanish lesson, do you? Okay. Well, thank you very much again, Abby, and all the folks at GMRI for running this project and for all of the schools all over Maine and organizations that are participating. It's incredibly important to have your participation more than you would ever know. So we're grateful for that. As there's a bunch of people maybe who haven't done this before and ones who have, I'm going to give a quick review of the indicator species for vernal pools. All of you know about this little charismatic shrimp called the fairy shrimp, the freshwater analog of the sea monkeys and wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and the blue spotted complex, which is a genetically diverse group of salamanders. So Abby's already told us a little bit what they are. I'm just going to repeat. They're temporary in that they're not temporary wetlands. They just have temporary hydrology that they fill right about now with snow melt and rain, and then they dry down by the end of the growing season, usually. Smaller than ponds, bigger than puddles. The key feature, because they dry down, is no breeding fish. Green frogs are bullfrogs because those pond frogs eat all of the specialized vernal pool species that breed in this habitat, like the wood frogs and the salamanders and the fairy shrimp. In the state of Maine, we identify a subset of pools called significant vernal pools by egg mass numbers for each of these species. So if you have 40 wood frog or 20 spotted or 10 blue spotted egg masses, it becomes a pool that is subject to some state regulation. And we have you give estimates of egg mass numbers if you can when you're going out and doing your field work. It's a 250-foot zone around the pool that the state regulates. And it doesn't mean you can't get a permit. It just means within this zone, you have to have a permit. So I've had students over the years who have studied inside the vernal pool and looking at what's going on in the winter and looking at what's going on in the spring where egg masses are laid. So we know a lot about the vernal pool depression where you folks are doing your work. But what we don't know, and I thought you might find interesting, is what happens after these animals leave the magic circle that is regulated. So over the years, my students have looked at migration patterns of vernal pool amphibians as they leave their pools and go to upland forests, or they leave their pools and go to forested wetlands, or as the juveniles, the young ones that come out of the pools, as they disperse to go find other vernal pools. So we've been looking at how these animals go back and forth to their pools and how they use the habitat that they live in 95% of the time in the forests. They're only in the pools for a few weeks as adults, and then the larvae develop, and then all of the young leave the pool. So that's really only one piece of vernal pool ecology. So, what our students have done is they've looked at what happens to the animals after the pool dries up and they go back to our forests. So, in order to do that, we fit them with radio transmitters so that we can track the beeping sounds and figure out where these animals are spending their time after they leave the breeding pool. Salamanders, we can't fit waist belts on because they're so slender, they would slip right off. So we have to actually do little implants of radio transmitters into the salamanders and then follow them around that way. And here's what it looks like. One student did a study in Bangor, Maine, to look at how animals in subdivisions behave. So every different colored line is a different wood frog. And every red dot is a place where the wood frog stopped and the students got data on it. So we learn information about how they move through subdivisions to get to their summer habitat of whatever forest is left. We did the same thing in Western Maine in the mountains, and here you see each dot represents where a wood frog has stopped. And the surprise for us here is people didn't think that wood frogs climbed mountains or spent the summers on the top of mountains. They thought they only went to forested wetlands. So, depending on where you are in the state, where your animals use the post-breeding habitat is going to vary. So, we learned a very big lesson there that not all animals behave the same. We've also followed them through the winter to see where they hibernate. And this is my student Tom. He put it's called an exclosure around where the frog went down so that we can get back to it in the spring and put a transmitter on it and follow it back to its pool. So we're studying where do they choose to hibernate, and after they come out of hibernation, where do they go? So 25 years of data I'm going to summarize for you right here. Migration distances of juveniles and adults farther than you think, way beyond the 250 feet. Some of these animals go miles. That helps you think about what does the habitat around a vernal pool look like? Are there connections to forest and to other wetlands that these animals use throughout their life history? Do they breed and hibernate in same pools and uplands? Now, these animals all hibernate in the uplands. They definitely 95% of them go back to the same pool they were born from. And what we found out is they're probably going back to the same spot where they hibernated. What this tells you is that we should try not to destroy vernal pools because the animals are very tied to their own particular landscape in that they come back to the same pool and they tend to go to the same place to hibernate. And where they go after breeding, I showed you, depends very much on where they live. So in central and southern Maine, blue spotted and wood frogs like to go to forested wetlands. In the mountains, they go up the mountains and live around the boulders, water forming around the boulders or on top of boulders and mosses. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we conserve their habitat. Does development around a pool stress them? Absolutely. We definitely need to maintain good forest contact around the pool. So that's a little bit about the animals that use the pool, but if you want to convince the public that these are important for a lot of other reasons beyond the pool footprint for amphibians, let's think about what else uses these pool. They're sort of fast food oases and where the animals can eat in. These camera traps show baby bears going to a vernal pool towards the end of the summer to feed deer, um, red fox. Here you see a fisher using the pool. We have had, this is in my backyard, the barred owls will go in and you can't believe it. They're just picking up a spotted salamander. And I've had many reports of this happen. A bobcat and herons and other shorebirds go and feed in these vernal pools. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that a lot of the animals are tied into the rhythm of food in vernal pools. A lot of food in the spring in the form of eggs and adults, and a lot of food as things are drying down towards the end of the summer in young amphibians and lots of plant material. Here you see a raccoon foraging. We also provide takeout services. Now, since we have radio transmitters on our animals, we've found beeping hawks, which come and take amphibians and take them away, and predation by garter snakes, of both wood frogs and salamanders. So
Wow.
there's a lot of protein leaving the pool and going out into our forests and providing food for other wildlife. And in Maine, it's possible that people don't love amphibians and teleostomus and fairy shrimp as much as we do, but when you explain to them that these provide feeding areas for bear, moose, turkeys, ducks, and deer, and things that they care about, then sometimes we can get them to be more concerned with how we take care of our vernal pools. And I just wanted to give you, since Abby asked for some updates, yesterday there was a hearing on the vernal pool regulation, and a bill was proposed to strengthen regulations around vernal pools and to provide that first 100 feet around the pool to not be developed. And it is the work of people like you folks and my graduate students and all the volunteers who've worked on vernal pools, who provide data and come out and speak for vernal pools that make the difference. And the hearing went very well, and it was based on results from our research and from volunteer efforts such as yours that show widespread support. And I also leave you with one other thing. Um, Maine has been recognized as a leader in volunteer efforts and in vernal pool conservation. And so I have now linked up with a group in Michigan who's going to work together on programs such as GMRI, on mapping, and on research that is going to link the Midwest with the Northeast. And so people are watching Maine, and it's because of the work of all you folks. And I'm going to leave you with something very positive there.
That's so awesome, Aram. Really cool to hear that this kind of data is used to help push some policy too.
Absolutely.
It's awesome. Great. Are there any questions for Aram? We can also wait and hold off after Hamish talks. And feel free as we go to drop any questions in the chat as well. Great. I'll turn it over to Hamish then. You're muted, Hamish.
There we go. Am I good now? Can you hear me now?
All set. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. So what I'm excited to talk about is a little bit more about these creatures that we're studying and why they're cool and some of the research that we're doing. And the first of these, as Aram mentioned, the fairy shrimp. And these are fascinating organisms. They're sort of about maybe an inch long when they're in their full size. And the reason they're fascinating is because their life cycle requires drying to happen. So they can only live in vernal pools because they make these eggs that need to survive a period of drying and freezing before they're viable to hatch. And then
Hamish,
once,
I'm not sure if it's just me, but I can't see your screen.
okay, let me just,
Oh,
I'll
there we
reshare.
go.
So
Yeah.
we can see it now? Okay,
Yep.
cool.
Perfect. Thanks.
Um, and so those eggs hatch, and then the organism races through its life cycle in 6 weeks, becomes an adult, mates, and is able to lay new eggs. And so it's very specialized to environments like vernal pools that only have water for a short period of time. And that gives them a leg up on a bunch of other organisms that can't develop as quickly. So vernal pools are kind of their specialist stronghold of habitat. And the other species that's really cool and has the same life cycle are caddisflies. Caddisflies that inhabit vernal pools have the same ability to withstand drying. So what they do is they lay their eggs in vernal pools in the dry phase underneath logs and vegetation, and those hang out in these jelly-like egg masses protected from drying out. And then snow falls, covers the eggs, and as the pool melts out in the spring, those eggs hatch. And then these caddisflies race through their life cycle as larvae, and they build themselves these little cases, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they go through a few phases, and then they pupate just like a caterpillar does, and then emerge as an adult. And that adult flies around in the landscape just after the pool dries up and provides a stage that doesn't need water. So again, these caddisflies can inhabit these drying vernal pools where a lot of their other potential predators and competitors can't. And the caddisflies that we have in vernal pools are a couple of different varieties that you might see. One is called these giant case-building caddisflies, and they make their cases out of pieces of leaf or twig or bark or sticks, and they use silk just like a spider does. They have silk, and they glue those pieces of vegetation together. And one of the things those cases do is give them protection from predators. And one of the ways they do that is by camouflage. And you might think all these little things here are leaves in the bottom of a pond, but if we let them move around, you'll start to see these caddisflies. These are giant case-building caddisflies starting to crawl around. There's one in the center right here that's going off on a walk. And so you wouldn't, a predator wouldn't think they're prey until they see them move. So it gives them this a really cool ability to protect themselves. It can also make them quite hard to find for us because they blend into the surrounding vegetation in the vernal pools. Another common species that we find are the northern case-building caddisflies. And these build a slightly different case. They build these long cylindrical cases that looks like sort of a big cigar, and they glue together pieces of vegetation in tight spirals. And these are really interesting because some of them eat leaves and other material, but others actually eat the jelly around salamander and frog eggs. And so they're a potential predator for amphibians as well as being something that eats vegetation. And we find these quite often in vernal pools in Maine and throughout the Northeast. The reason why these organisms are important is that they provide a connection in vernal pool food webs that move nutrients and energy through and ultimately feeds organisms like salamanders. So our caddisflies are really good at eating dead leaves. And if you've ever seen a vernal pool in Maine, it is full of dead leaves. And the caddisflies eat those dead leaves, turn that material into their own bodies, and then those caddisflies are eaten by predators like salamanders, or when they emerge into the forest, by things like birds and bats and lizards and spiders. And those caddisflies also pee and poop just like any other animal does, and that creates nutrients that feed other organisms. For example, fairy shrimp feed on microscopic plants called phytoplankton, and those plants use the nutrients that other animals like caddisflies excrete to develop and grow. And so fairy shrimp move energy and nutrients from phytoplankton up into the food web where they can be consumed by caddisflies and by salamanders. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing recently. And this is actually in different vernal pools. These vernal pools are in the mountains of Colorado, just on tree lines. So they're about 11,000 feet. And these are really interesting environments that have caddisflies. And we've been studying them, me and my collaborators have been studying them for over 30 years. And just a few years ago, you might see me looking kind of excited over here. We discovered a new species of caddisfly in these high elevation ponds. And that caddisfly was only known from lower elevation environments, way down in the valleys below where we sample. And so this is an example of a species that's moved up in elevation as the winters have got warmer and the snow's melting earlier. And maybe for that species, it's finding a new refuge habitat in those high elevation environments. And so one of the things that we're doing as scientists is trying to work out, well, what happens when a new species moves into a system that we know very well? And this caddisfly does all sorts of things. It eats leaves, so it might influence how nutrients move around. But it's also eaten by tiger salamanders, which are a particularly cool type of salamander because they have a few different types of adults. One goes through metamorphosis like the spotted salamanders here and crawls around the landscape. Whereas another morph looks a bit more like an axolotl, and actually it's called pedomorphosis, where it's a reproductive adult, but it's got gills and has to stay within the ponds. So it kind of behaves a little bit like a fish in that it's stuck in these permanent ponds and eats things like caddisflies. And the interesting thing about this new species is it's active through the winter where most of the other caddisflies we sample aren't. So the story for us is we have to go up there once the snow falls, which at 11,000 feet is quite challenging. So here you can see us on the right-hand side breaking the ice so we can sample the caddisflies underneath and the salamanders. And one of the things we were doing when we were out there is we were doing samples of the caddisflies to count how many there are and what species and how many of this new species we're finding. We put out bags of leaves to look at how fast those leaves are being eaten by the new species of caddisfly. And then the other thing we were doing was looking at whether these caddisflies were being eaten by salamanders. This new species maybe provides these salamanders with something to eat before they hunker down over the winter. And this is a video here of us stomach flushing a salamander. And what it's doing is essentially puking out pieces of caddisfly. And then we're able to count those caddisflies and see how important they are for the salamanders as a prey source before they hunker down over winter in the bottom of the ponds. So why is this important to Maine? Well, I think these same kinds of dynamics are probably happening in Maine, where we have Maine being quite a northern state. It's getting warmer, and as it gets warmer, new species might be moving into Maine, and the species that are in Maine might be moving further north into vernal pools in Canada. So one of the questions we have is, well, where are we finding fairy shrimp and caddisflies in Maine? But have those distributions changed as Maine's winters have got warmer and the hydrology around vernal pools might have been changing? And then I think the next question is, does that mean some species are at risk? And one of the challenges we have as scientists is knowing enough to determine whether species are at risk. And one of the things we can do is provide more information on where populations are of different species and are those populations declining or increasing. And you can imagine that requires a lot of sampling all over the state of Maine, and that's where your help comes in. Because here's me with a net. It would take me years to go sample the number of vernal pools that this group can sample in one season. And that ability to get boots on the ground, to get out there and look at these habitats and look at what caddisflies and fairy shrimp are doing and where we find them is a really unique opportunity for us to learn more about these species and learn more about their potential threats in the future. Thank you very much. I'll stop my sharing here.
Thanks, Hamish. That's so cool to see the new species. That's really exciting. So we can open it up for questions. We have about 15-ish minutes. I'm really curious for Hamish. Where do caddisflies go in the winter, or do they lay their eggs somewhere? Because we saw that the amphibians tend to move, but yeah.
So the caddisflies that are specialized to vernal pools often inhabit the winter as either adult, usually as eggs. So those eggs that are laid underneath logs, and they have the jelly around them to stop them from drying out, and they're insulated from the cold by the snow above. But this new species actually can only live in vernal pools that don't dry out. So in some ways, they're not the classic vernal pools. And it goes to the deepest, but we think it goes to the deepest parts of the ponds and buries itself down in the soft sediment, and is able to sort of withstand a little bit of freezing to be able to make it through. And we think one of the reasons why that new species is doing better up at those higher elevations is the winters aren't as cold, and so the ponds don't freeze as solidly as they might have in the past. And so it's giving them the chance to live in this new environment.
Interesting. I saw Aram asked if the species you found were new to science or just new to the elevation.
New to the elevation. And one of the reasons we know that is because my collaborators and I have been sampling there since 1989, well before I was ready to sample pools. I was, I think, 7
Oh.
at that age.
Oh.
And so because we've sampled these for so long, we've got this record of when new things come in. And that's one of the challenges that we can get at with this project is we accumulate information year on, year out, and that makes it easier to see when things change.
What's the family of that new species?
It's a limnophilid.
It is, okay. That's really neat,
Yeah,
Hamish.
a giant
I'm
king.
not going to feel sorry for you having to go to Colorado in the winter. I'm just not going to feel sorry for you.
It is fun. It is a fun place to be.
That has to be really cool too to have access to that long of a data set.
It's pretty critical, which is why, with these folks doing this work year after year after year, we don't have a baseline. We need a baseline so that we can then measure and document change over time, as Hamish is saying. It's a perfect analog, Hamish. It must have been so exciting. Holy cow.
Ram, I'm curious how this data is helpful for that migration data. So how is like understanding where vernal pools are and where those species are, how that's helpful when you're tracking
Well,
the different amphibians.
well, if people are estimating egg mass counts and such, we get a general idea of how intact the surrounding landscape is. And if numbers are, I think that you have people take pictures, so it's very helpful to see what the context of these pools where we're getting this data is. If certain amphibians are missing from the pool, or if some of the invertebrates are missing from the pool, if we have the pool location and we can look on Google Earth and see what the surrounding habitat is like, we might be able to start putting together what the relationship between intact forest and species assemblages in these pool in abundance is. So are they able to leave the pool and find the habitat that they need so that they can come back every year and be productive?
Okay, we had a question come in the chat that is, what is the criteria for labeling a pool as a vernal pool? And does it have to have all the species that were mentioned?
Well, in Maine, every state is different. In Maine, a vernal pool just has the indicator species, regardless. But in Maine, a significant vernal pool, the one that's covered in the legislation, must have the egg mass numbers of any one of the amphibian species. So 40 for wood frog, 20 for spotted, and 10 for blue spotted. Presence of fairy shrimp and presence of an endangered or threatened species all kick it into the significant vernal pool category.
In classifying a vernal pool in general, it's like no running water, right? No fish present.
So no breeding fish populations, no permanent inlet and outlet. Like it might be connected to the river in the spring for a short period of time, but the key is that there aren't breeding populations of fish and of the amphibians that eat the vernal pool amphibians. And Hamish, that made me wonder, do you have fish in your permanent pools in California?
You mean Colorado?
Yes.
Yeah. No, no, they don't have fish, and so the permanent ponds have pedomorphic salamanders.
Yeah,
So they
because
still have
they
a large
don't
fish,
have fish. Okay,
but no fish. Yeah.
perfect.
Just-
Okay, thank you.
if they did have fish, they wouldn't have salamanders, and we know
They
that.
they wouldn't if they well, you could have minnows and have those salamanders, but you don't even have minnows, nothing.
nothing.
Okay, perfect.
Mhm.
Are those salamanders the type that could potentially adapt to living on land?
Well, their morph that goes through full metamorphosis
Mhm.
can live on land, but it still needs to lay its eggs in water, and the larvae need to develop in water. So they're tied to water. Yeah.
Right, another question we got was, what is the species of caddisfly larva in Maine vernal pools? And is it a unique species from caddisfly larvae that aren't in vernal pools?
So the two groups I talked about, the northern case builders and the giant case builders, those are different families of caddisflies. One is Limnophilidae, and then the other is Phragoniidae. And within those families, there's a lot of different species. And some of those species only inhabit vernal pools because they can only really inhabit environments without predatory fish. And they go through a drying and they have to go through drying to be able to inhabit those environments. But then there are other species of those families that you find in big lakes. And so there's different sort of specialist species and different types of sort of still water environment. And the species we're finding in Colorado, this new one, is called Nematalius, which for us is fun because then we say we're finding Nemo as our project title. And that is common in Maine. So it's a northern species, it's common in Maine. And in Colorado, it's about the southernmost of its distribution, but it can inhabit those environments because it's up high. Um,
In Maine, where, Hamish? Is that a vernal pool species or
more permanent waters here.
okay?
Yeah.
Fishless lakes,
But
maybe?
yeah, and you actually the pond we have in the botanical gardens on campus has
I
Nematalius, which is
didn't know
kind of
that.
fun. Which we can go show students and talk about, what they might how they might differ between Maine and Colorado, which is really fun.
So what's their case? How do we know if we got a nematolis? I'd never heard of it.
As they get larger, they make their case out of circular discs of leaves, and they lay those on top of each other, almost like you knocked a pile of coins over. And so they're really distinctive when they
Oh,
get to
that's
those later
cool.
stages. Yeah, they're
Wow.
really cool. And
Wow.
their head, and they're big enough to be able to see their head if you look closely. It looks like a little power button with a circle with a line through it. That's how we tell them apart from other species. And
That's fantastic. I'm going to look for those this year.
It's really cool. All right, another question was, could you tell us which species might die within a year and which might live to reproduce for the next year? So I think the question is, are there some organisms that their life cycle is within the vernal pool, and then others that can then reproduce?
Oh, that's a good question.
so in terms of the insects and the fairy shrimp, so the fairy shrimp all complete their life cycle and die within a few months or a few weeks. But then the next generation carries on in these eggs that can undergo drying. Most of the caddisflies have a 1 year life cycle, but they might only be alive as adults or larvae for about 6 months, and then the rest of the time they're eggs. But some of the caddisflies can have a 2 year life cycle, and they have to deal with being around during the winter. And in most environments, that's as larvae underneath for the ice and frozen ponds.
So the flying away caddisflies, they will die before the winter.
Yeah, they can't survive the winter as adults flying around the landscape. Yeah.
Do they feed when they're flying around, or are they like some other species that don't eat?
Yep, they don't eat, so they're
Okay.
only usually alive for a few weeks. The species that we have in Colorado is alive for about 30 or 40 days, and it just sits in the trees, and that's all it does. Doesn't eat, it just sits in the trees, living off its fat reserves, and waits for its eggs to develop a bit more, and then comes down and lays them.
Wow, what a life.
Yeah,
So do a lot of the species need the drying out of the pools in order to reproduce? Yeah.
yeah, they
Very.
don't need it. Sorry, you
No,
go.
I was just going to say, even marbled salamanders, we don't have them, but there is a salamander that needs the pool to dry down, along with Hamish's people.
Yeah. So some of the bugs I study, they need the pool to go through drying to get to trigger the eggs to hatch. And others, they need it because they need to not have big predators around. And the drying prevents big predators from being in the environment. So while they could live in a permanent water body, they usually are excluded by large predators.
Interesting. So another question if there's no other questions in the chat. We've seen a lot of times when people will take data, they'll take photos of different like other types of invertebrates and larvae and things like that. So do you have any tips on identifying fairy shrimp or caddisflies that make them stand out from some other invertebrates?
Fairy shrimp, they swim around on their backs, and they have lots of little legs that sort of move around like this as they're swimming, and that's pretty unique for them. I'm trying to think of things they would be confused with, but
Well, if sometimes, believe it or not, Hamish, people confuse them with mosquito larvae.
mhm.
We on our website we have some field cards to identify vernal pool species and some of the confusing other animals that people make mistakes about, and that's for free for downloading on pools and people. So, but yeah, Hamish, we've had a lot of people report mosquito larvae as fairy shrimp.
Mhm. And then caddisflies are the only insect that you're likely to find in a vernal pool that builds a case. There's an aquatic moth that builds cases, but you only find those in lakes. And so if you find a I mean, a caterpillar-like thing crawling around in a case that it's built in the pool, then that's very much going to be a caddisfly.
And there's a very cute little handbook, like you can bring in the field, a field guide. I think it's a golden guide to pond life. And a lot of the animals that are in vernal pools but are also in ponds are in that field guide. And that's a really fun thing to have. I think it's a golden guide. The title is Pond Life, and it's a little tiny booklet with all of the species. Like you'll get water boatmen and back swimmers and um what are they called, Hamish? The clear worm larvae with the midges, things like that are in that book. So everybody should have one of those. It's really fun to identify the things that are in even in the big ponds.
Yeah, it's cool. We see a lot of different things in the vernal pools.
Yeah,
There's
they're very diverse.
dragonfly larvae and
Yeah, they're
black fly
very
larvae.
diverse. Not just. And there is a question about salamanders and frogs and age. So wood frogs live 3 to 5 years, and they're reproductively active at 2. And the salamanders can live in perfect conditions if they don't get run over by cars for 15 to 20 years. And because they're so long-lived, they don't necessarily breed every year. If the conditions aren't good, if it's too dry or too cold, they skip a year because they have time. Wood frogs never skip a year because they don't live that long. So we've had wood frogs in our research projects that moved to the vernal pools 32 degrees, no rain in sight because it was time to move and they made their way to the pools. So there's a big difference in the life histories of, we call them all vernal pool amphibians, but they all have very different life histories. So that was a good question. Yeah, these salamanders, you really need to, they could be going to college. You have to have a lot of respect for those animals. They live so long.
The salamanders in Colorado have been studied for about the same amount of time, and they have studied with tags.
Yeah,
And there's one individual that's over 30 years old, which is
that's over 30. Is that a tiger salamander?
yeah, it's a tiger salamander, and it's a pedomorph tiger salamander, so it has
Oh,
it's
wow,
30 years
Hamish,
old.
that
Amazing.
is amazing.
So that means that that salamander has been in the same pool for like the last 30 years.
Yep.
Wow, that's amazing. Have you considered doing an interview with it and seeing what it goes on and what changes it perceives?
If you look at its body, it's definitely had a hard life. A
Oh, that is so
lot of little nicks and
interesting.
scratches.
Are they little pit tags that you have on them? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and that's run by a professor called Howard Whiteman, who started working out there in 1992, I think.
fabulous. See, this is going to be all you guys eventually in 30 years. You're going to say, yeah, I worked with GMRI.
Yeah, it's cool. I think our data set's 5 or 6 years now. Um, so really cool to start seeing some patterns and hopefully, yeah, it becomes this larger, longer data set.
So I'm curious who Zoom user and the others who haven't identified themselves are. Karen has identified herself. Who are the other people participating?
Yeah, if anyone wants to drop in the chat, I believe we have some folks from Hodgdon, Maine.
Okay, so a school,
So there's school. Yep.
Hodgkin
Yep.
Middle
Hodgdon
School.
Middle
Thank
School.
you.
Yep.
And Hamish, there's a question for you, the lifespan of a fairy shrimp. They may have missed it when you said that.
Yeah, only about 6 weeks from hatching of the egg to the adult, so really quick.
And where are Lori B. and Sarah McQuarrie from? Like to know who we're talking to.
So Sarah I know is from Hodgdon.
Hodgdon. Okay, okay. And South Thomaston. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. So cool. We got a pretty broad geographic range.
Yep. Well, the southern people, it's time to get out to the pools. You'll have all your egg masses laid. It might be even too late for fairy shrimp at this point. Oh, someone's got a full of fairy shrimp right now.
Oh.
Wow, on Mount Desert. Oh, fantastic. That is just great.
I was up around Machias last week and they had a bunch of wood frog and salamander eggs. So that was cool to see.
Very nice.
Awesome. Well, we're at the end of our time. Thanks so much, Aram and Hamish, for joining and chatting today. And thanks for everyone for coming on. Yeah, now it's the season to go out and make those observations. So in the next few weeks, if you're excited to go out and have any questions, let me know. And yeah, happy observing. Vernal pools
Happy
are so
observing.
cool. It's one of my favorite times of the year.
Well, thank you, everybody. And Hamish, I was pleased to learn
Thank you
about your
all.
work. It's great.
Yeah, thanks
Okay.
everyone.
All right. Thanks, Abby. Bye-bye.
Bye.